There is so much star power on this stage. I feel like it's the Oscars for people who are interested in journalism and international reporting, which I guess makes me the Chris Rock of the proceedings. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. This is a New Lines event at the Frontline Club. I'm Faisal Yafai. This is Lydia Wilson. And tonight we are going to be discussing memoir and journalism. As always, I say this every time we have these events. You hear me all right? Yeah. I say this every time we have these events. I really appreciate you guys coming out. I know you have so many options in London. I really appreciate you guys coming and having these conversations with us because I enjoy them, and I think you'll really enjoy tonight if you haven't been here before. This is the 5th event that we have done after Chicago, New York, DC, Beirut. Lydia was in Beirut. She flew straight back. Thank you, Lydia. And now we are back where it all started in London. So I don't really need to introduce our guests, but I'm going to. But you guys, I mean, like, it's strange to me to even look at them because this is what I see on my television most days. So I turn to my right and I see our two guests who between them have 47 years of reporting experience, 9 Emmys and two Peabody Awards. Clarissa Ward is currently Chief International Correspondent for CNN and has spent her career covering, as you all know, major international events like the 2011 tsunami in Japan, the 2022 floods in Pakistan, the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, the Syrian uprising, which is for what she won her Peabody in 2012. She's reported from the front lines of wars in Syria, in Afghanistan, and of course most recently in Ukraine. Until last year, Hala Gorani was an anchor and correspondent for CNN International, presenting Hala Gorani Tonight every weeknight?
Yes.
Without exception.
For 23 years.
For 23 years. She's currently taking a break from breaking news to work on her memoir, which is what we're going to talk about, and other projects. Like Clarissa, she's covered global events like the 2020 earthquake in Haiti, the 2015 Paris attacks, the Arab Spring, which is what she won her Peabody for. Clarissa Ward, Hala Gorani, welcome to the Frontline. The reason we're going to talk to them today is about memoir, which they've both recently turned their attentions to. Clarissa's memoir, On All Fronts, The Education of a Journalist, was released last year, and Hala is currently working on hers, which is going to be published next year. Right. Yeah, and an extract of that was published in our latest issue of the magazine, which you guys all saw, and which you have already had the disappointing news that you cannot get your hands on. What? Who said we are going to start having booze? Whose idea was this? All right, should we start? Do you want to start?
Yes. Well, yes, let's just jump right into our memoir then. Hala, as Faisal already mentioned, you've been reporting on international events. You said 23 years, right? 23 years every week, night. But you've taken a sabbatical recently, specifically to work on the memoir and other freelance projects. That must have been quite an adjustment, right?
Well, I went from, having 10 minutes to write something to having 2 years to write something, and deadlines are very different in the publishing world. Though this is a real learning curve for me because nothing happens for 9 months and then suddenly 8 people email you that they need something Monday. And I just don't understand how there's this stop and go rhythm in the publishing world. So it's I'm really venturing into this with a lot of humility and open eyes because it's very new to me. The essay in New Lines is not an extract. It's actually something that I wrote after I went back to Missouri to do some research for the book. So I just kind of had a little breakout moment and decided to write about my impressions on this research trip. So it's the polar opposite world. I'm interviewing my mom, I used to interview prime ministers and now I interview my mom. And I used to be in a studio with jib cameras and lighting and professional makeup, and now I'm in my kitchen every morning. So it's really the polar opposite world and environment rhythm.
It's not just about the rhythm though, is it? There's something very, very different about turning your attention inwards. You're focusing, you're introspecting. And after spending so long very much focused outwards on major political issues and events, that must feel a very different way of working intellectually.
It is and it isn't, because my memoir is also about, weaves in the history of Syria. It's about identity and belonging and finding a home. So it's as much about my impressions and my challenges growing up as a third culture kid, as the child of first generation immigrants, as it is also about these big world events, because they also shape how people of immigrant extraction experience the world. So the war in Syria affected my family tremendously. The 1965, Immigration Act, loosening immigration controls in the U.S. affected my family, allowed my father to immigrate and end up in Missouri for 2 years. So these big world events also shape your personal life and how you experience the world. So there's an intersection to those two things for me.
So how did you find that? Because you did the memoir, you had a lot of time to think about your own personal experiences, and it was a long period of time. You were talking about your whole life. And then you've gone back into breaking news. Was that an adjustment?
So I wrote a book because I was pregnant with my first child, and I had been approached about writing a book some years earlier, and for whatever reason, it filled me with very intense fear. Fear of failure, fear of not being a great writer, fear of not having interesting material. And I remember my literary agent, who's this force of a woman in New York called Binky Urban, said to me, don't get hung up on thinking you need to be the best writer in the world. What you need to have is a voice. And the reader really needs to just be able to latch onto your voice pretty early on and say, okay, I can follow this story. That gave me the confidence to think maybe I could write a book. But the thing that gave me the kick in the ass to be okay, I must write a book, was getting pregnant with my first child and feeling like I had a story that I needed to tell my children so that they would understand the person I am, the choices I made, the risks I took, the absences from home, all these kinds of things. And so that really was my incentive for writing a book. It ended up becoming kind of a love letter to journalism rather than a kind of mea culpa to my children. But that's how it started. And because it had, I think, a very specific goal in that sense, the minute I finished writing the first draft, I was ready to kind of move on and get back to my job again. Which unfortunately then, as anyone who's written a book knows, that's really just the tip of the iceberg, and you're expected to do a lot more work after that. But so it wasn't such a hard thing for me to go back to work because I felt like I had done what I needed to do.
We'll come to the process question, I think, but I want to ask about the voice. Because you already have a voice. I mean, you have a particular way of doing your job. And then you also have this other voice in terms of the writing.
Well, I think that what you realize, or what I realize, so much of what informs our work happens behind the scenes, right? Off camera. And you have all these small, beautiful moments with people of profound connection, or sometimes very sad, very painful moments. And they never make it onto the evening news, but they tell more of a story about a conflict or a people. They humanize, they allow people to connect in a way that sometimes these news stories that we do, which are rooted in kind of geopolitics and telling the broader story and giving both sides, etc., they kind of leave that out. And so I think that to me is just so hugely important. It's like having an outlet for all of these beautiful moments and all of these quiet small things that happen behind the camera that actually say a lot more than me standing there with my microphone wanging on.
Well, like Hala, you have over 2 decades of experience, and you cover that whole 2 decades in your book, and you report, well, you describe very, very vividly the pressures of the day-to-day of that kind of life and the tolls it takes. And I just wondered, what is it about the sort of reporting you do from those very high pressure environments that keeps you coming back despite the danger, the pressure, the difficulties, the emotional toll?
I think it's, for me, everyone who does this does it for different reasons, and some people are really drawn to the excitement of getting to write a first draft of history or being a part of that, and some people are drawn to the adrenaline of being in incredibly high-risk situations. For me, I'm not drawn to that side of it, the high-risk side. I find that deeply petrifying and sort of, something that you kind of have to live with and get around in order to do the job. But for me, like, the juice, as it were, is that things are really distilled to their rawest elements when you are in conflict zones or a place of extreme crisis. And so you really have this kind of unvarnished view of humanity at its rawest element. And so much of the crap that fills our heads when we're, living our normal lives here in London, like, it's just not relevant. It doesn't have a place. It's just nonsense. And that I find very refreshing and actually very humbling, and on a certain level, it can be quite profound spiritually, even, to be kind of forced back to that place where you have to strip everything down and look at things in their kind of most essential form. So that is what keeps me.
You were nodding along, Hannah. I imagine that, you talk about the juice, 23 years of that juice, that's a very, very hard thing. We'll come to the giving it up part temporarily, but let's go back to the part of how do you deal with it? 23 years, year in and year out, you've written about how difficult it was on a personal level, that you will go to these places in the middle of your birthday party or something, you have to go because there's been a crisis.
I was an anchor I've been an anchor for many, many years, and Clarissa has really been in the field her entire career. So my pressures were a little bit different. I've covered a few conflict zones and I've done some high pressure assignments, but I think anchoring every single day, and people really discount the amount of anxiety it produces to constantly talk about the worst of humanity every single day for an hour.
Day, yeah.
And again, I mentioned Syria and the Arab Spring because it had a personal impact on my family and my life. So for about a decade, and more acutely in the first 4 or 5 years of the following the uprising in Syria, it was seeing places people streets you recognize, family members you love having to flee, having to go live in various countries and live with their kids in Michigan when they had planned on, retiring in Aleppo and stuff like that. And I realized that it started causing extreme anxiety for me, a lot more so than I anticipated, even though I was in a TV studio. And there came a time where I could just not watch video anymore coming from Syria. I spent a whole year heavily editing what I was watching. Even on my own show, I would look away. So if we aired video of, say, a bombing and a civilian rescue in Aleppo or somewhere else, I would just look away. And sometimes I would take my earpiece out. I've never said this actually in public, maybe I shouldn't, but I would take my earpiece out so I wouldn't hear what was being said. So after a while, it really, really, I think, got to me. But what Clarissa said about really all the day-to-day routine stuff falling away when you're confronted with the worst tragedy that anyone has ever lived through, that is both emotionally impactful, but at the same time it's also addictive, because you are addicted to that feeling of living. This is the most dramatic, unbelievably tragic thing that can happen to anyone, and you're witnessing it, and you become a little bit addicted to that feeling of being alive. You feel more alive when you report on those stories. I don't know if you feel 100%. The same way.
Yeah.
But
it feels like it brings up complicated emotions, because on the one hand you crave it, but on the other hand, and of course it's a privilege to be there at those moments of great historical merit.
Yeah. But the complexity comes afterwards. That's the thing. When you're in the moment, there's no time for thinking. You're just in it, and it's pure, and it's real, and it's visceral, and it feels authentic. Then you get back home, and you have to sit with it and break it down and try to understand it and try to unpack how it's impacting you. And it does impact you invariably. And I always tell young journalists this, like, you're not going to do this job for a long time and think that you're not going to get the bill at some point. Like, you're getting it, and you may not realize when it's coming, and you may not recognize it, and it may not follow some neat linear trajectory, but it does have an impact. And and frankly, whether you're in the anchor studio watching it day in and day out, whether you're going out in the field and experiencing it, it still leaves that kind of an imprint. And that's a difficult tension, that push-pull of, on the one hand, feeling very drawn to it, feeling that you are alive, as Hala says, which I think is a really great way of describing it, in those moments, but then also thinking when you get home, like, what does that say about me as a human being, and what role am I playing here, and how am I like a vulture in some ways, right? I mean, and how do I give back, and then also how do I enjoy my normal life, because when I come home I want to be back there again, and I want to feel those feelings again, even though I'm so exhausted and empty.
So do all of these complex emotional feelings, whether it's observing something much closer to home for you, Hala, or arriving home from a very intense situation for you, Clarissa, did these feelings play a part in your decision to then write a memoir, to actually interrogate it in a more sustained way? Hala?
Not really. For me, my memoir is about my search for identity and belonging as the child of immigrant parents, moved around. Really, the best way to describe it is bounced around. Every 2 or 3 years, a different country, divorced parents, raised in France, born in Seattle, 2 years in Missouri, a bit in Algeria, then Paris, then DC, then back to Paris, then London. I mean, so how does that shape the person you become? Part of the reason I became a journalist and this job is perfect for me is because of this upbringing, I believe. But I wanted to explore what it's like to look for home when you don't feel at home anywhere. So my job and this history of Syria and the Paris attacks and all the rest of it, they come in and out of that journey. They underpin some of the journey. It's not central, unlike Clarissa's memoir, which is, she aptly described as a love letter to journalism. Mine is just slightly different. Also because my journalistic field experience is now a bit more in the past. And so, I thought I had a more interesting story to tell if I looked at that other subject matter.
I think also sometimes what you set out to write and what you end up writing are very different things.
Oh, that's
I started my book thinking it was going to literally be like a letter to my sons, being like, hi guys, this is why mommy did all this stuff. And then my agent was like, there's a lot of cursing and death in this book. And it looks like a very strange letter to write to your newborn baby. And all these themes that I hadn't necessarily thought I was preoccupied with in terms of getting under the skin a little bit more of, why you do this work and what it means and what it means to be a woman doing this work. It turns out that actually you do have a lot of thoughts on all these things, but the act of writing is what makes you dive much deeper into.
So what did you learn from the whole process? Seeing it now in retrospect, what did you get out of that introspection?
I think I understood a lot more clearly the psychological impact of doing this work, and I felt a lot more keenly the importance of talking about that more, because as far as we've come in this industry, there is still kind of a weird taboo around this idea of struggling with things that you've seen or things that you've experienced and witnessed or people you've been close to who've been killed or kidnapped or beheaded, God forbid, or and it's so odd because if you were talking to civilians, of course you'd be like, my goodness, you must be talking to someone about this, that you've seen that you've experienced that and sometimes it's vicarious, right? You just by virtue of spending time with people who have been through profound trauma. It's not even your trauma, but it's, it permeates. And yet there is still this slightly kind of swashbuckling war correspondent culture that doesn't really allow for exploration and discussion of that beyond like, well, that one night we all got so drunk and we threw up, and then, you know, you said that thing about being sad and it was really awkward and I punched you, and then we didn't talk about it anymore. I'm like,
Remember that
all right,
punch?
you know?
But I will say it's also harder for women. I don't know if Clarissa agrees, because women, and I write about this in my book, we're all encouraged now to talk about mental health. You see it on social media everywhere. But I think that when women open up about being vulnerable, they're worried that they will be described as weak and unable to cope. And I think men maybe are not as judged for exhibiting weakness. It's something I mean, without naming names, there are some female correspondents who've come back from tough situations and had obvious signs of PTSD and weren't necessarily sent back as quickly as their male counterparts were, because I think they were seen maybe as being kind of less able to cope with the stress.
Well, Clarissa, you did actually
Yeah.
address a lot of this in your book. The casual misogyny is how you put it at one point.
Yeah, but also the insensitivity. I mean, I was going through a very tough time. I had been covering Syria. My heart was completely consumed by this conflict. And I had become friends with a freelance journalist, Austin Tice, who disappeared. And you know, we know subsequently that he was taken by the regime, but at this stage we have been planning to meet up with his girlfriend and some other friends in Lebanon, and he never showed up, and it was that awful thing of just like endlessly days trying to find this person, trying to trace their steps, combing through pictures of massacres, looking for his tattoos, and I had never really experienced that collision of like, okay, this is my real life now also becoming part of this epic tragedy in a way that was new to me. And I told my bosses, I was like, okay, I'm actually, for the first time legitimately, I'm really struggling with this. And I was sort of thinking they were going to send me to some nice therapist who was, you know, going to tell me to lie on a sofa and, you know, make me feel better. They sent me to this therapist who like ran through a checklist of like, oh, are you suicidal? And I was like, what? How much do you sleep? Blah, blah. Are you still eating? And I was like, when's the bit where I like talk about my feelings? And they get to the end of this checklist and they're like, yeah, you're fine. You can still work. And I was like, I'm so confused. What do you mean? And it turned out, you know, it's like basically was some exercise in ass covering from the company that I was working for to make sure that I wasn't going to go and harm myself, and they were going to be responsible for it. But it was so startlingly insensitive and not what I needed in that moment. But it was also a real wake-up call. Like, no one else is going to be the person to help you with self-care, right? You have to be vigilant about that. You have to be proactive about that. And you have to create a space, ideally, where people can talk about it and bounce ideas off of each other. Because it's not going to come from your corporate overlords.
I wondered if I could pick up on that friendship. I hope that's okay with you, because you wrote very movingly about that. And in fact, there's a lot of, that's a theme throughout the book. There's a lot of people there that you build very close, sometimes very intense relationships with. And a lot of them get lost on the way. In Austin Tice's case, he was kidnapped, and his whereabouts is still unknown until today. And I just wondered, I mean, you didn't even meet Austin, did you, in real life? You had this very close relationship through the experiences of being in Syria. So it felt as close as any other friendship, right?
Yeah.
And I wondered, is there something about those experiences that kind of form these very intense friendships? There's a crucible.
I think there is. I think, first of all, it's always really difficult to talk about these experiences. So I would come home from Syria and, you know, have seen all sorts of horrible things, have made all these intense relationships, have learned in the subsequent days and weeks that people had been kidnapped or killed who I had spent time with. And, you know, and then you like go to a dinner party or a cocktail party and someone's like, how is Syria? And you're like, seriously? Yeah. We're not going to have that conversation right now. Not because you're not being sincere, but you're not really, because it's just, we can't go there right now. I definitely can't go there. And so what you end up doing is you realize, I'm not really talking to anyone about it. You come up with your potted 5 minutes, like, this is my take on Syria, right? And so I've fed you now, I've told you, and you feel like you're kind of au fait with the situation. But I haven't really gone there in any meaningful way. And so, and even within the industry as well, you're not really having those conversations because it's like, again, back to this kind of bro-y culture of just like, yeah, man, that was a close shave. And it's like, okay, please shut up. So with Austin, we had formed this close bond because like one of the first messages he sent me was like, I find it really hard when I see like bad things happen to Syrian children, and this is why I'm struggling, and this is why I'm drawn to this conflict, and this was, you know, one of the most beautiful experiences I had. And so just like literally 10 times a day, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, just emailing all the time. This was before WhatsApp and stuff. I'm like dating myself, but and it was so nice to have that with someone where you felt like, and I think the fact that we hadn't met in real life actually made it easier because there was a sort of secret sanctum element to the whole thing. I didn't have to worry about being judged or being ridiculed or being misunderstood because this conversation didn't really exist outside of this very protected bubble. And that's a really beautiful thing when you find that, where you can talk about those things with someone. Because in your real life, even with the best of intentions, my husband, I adore him, I can't really talk about a lot of this stuff with him. And we don't need to pretend that, you know, I can give a literal description, or I can write a book and be like, okay, now there you go. That's what it's like. But I just, you know, but you can't, it's not that often that you find people who you can. And I would say that Hala's like Hala and I definitely bonded over Syria and spent a lot of time talking and texting and weeping about Syria. But it's not that common.
Before you ask, I wanted to ask you about, because we're talking about Syria and how you found it a very personal story in some ways. Did you find that made it harder to talk to people, as Clarissa was saying, at dinner parties or in social settings? Because they're asking you, hey, what happened in the news today?
Yeah,
and
not just about Syria. I think when your full-time job is researching the news, reporting the news, reading the news, it's 10 hours of your day every day. The last thing you want to do when you go to a cocktail party is talk about the news.
But it's the only reason anyone invites you.
And then when Trump was elected, it was, what do you think about Trump? Did you hear that Trump thing? Could you do a Trump tweet? Trump. And you know, it's almost like you got more PTSD from that than anything. Because it was just like, I'm just so tired of talking about this kind of circular story. So I think when you talk about it on a superficial level, it's exhausting, but when you bond on a more profound level, it's cathartic. And I think with Clarissa and me, and because we shared an office for a few years, we had a little bit of a safe space there to exchange our more kind of considered thoughts on that and many other stories, actually. So it's great to find someone who works in the industry, who gets it, even if we're not exactly doing the same job day to day. It's kind of, yeah. And now we have WhatsApp, so there's that occasionally.
That distinction is, I think, quite a subtle one between the positionality that you were talking about earlier, that this is where you stand, and then the activism, which it can sometimes bleed into. How do you think you parse that line? Because, of course, you're both, as we said before, both of you are recognizable people. So it's not like, you know, with The Economist or something, people don't know your names and your faces. They can ascribe certain views to you, especially if they followed you for a long period of time. So how do you delineate that distinction between positionality, you have your own views, you have your own topics that are interesting to you, and then what you've called activism, where you start to
But
say...
I'm not going to tell you what to think, or I'm not going to tell you, you should go out and do this. You should sign this petition. You should join this protest. You should be outraged. You know, there are situations where we all do that. I mean, well, maybe not we all, but like, you read my book, I wrote a letter to Obama's like top foreign policy advisor saying, "Dear Ben, hope you're sleeping soundly as Aleppo burns." That was a transgression.
Well, you didn't broadcast that. That
I
was
mean,
a private email.
It was a private
that's-
email to his White House account. I mean, it was, I'm not ashamed of it because I'm a human being, right? And it was but it was not correct.
Oh, I didn't see that as crossing the line. That's interesting.
Yeah,
because
That's interesting.
because it wasn't
Why?
public. It wasn't public.
Public now, though.
It's public now.
It's public now, though.
Did you use your Gmail account?
Yes.
That's okay.
Yeah. I didn't use my CNN account. So
Well, there you go.
But I mean, even the fact that you guys disagree about whether that is the crossing the line tells
it
you-
makes me feel much better. Afterwards, I was
mean,
like, why
but-
did Chris said?
Aren't we allowed to be people as well? Like, you're allowed to have a time when you're not being a journalist where you can email other people and say what you think.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
That's how I read it.
Yeah, but ideally not like, the architect of Obama's foreign policy.
No,
But
ideally.
I think one of the biggest sort of game changers for our profession is social media,
Yeah.
where people now have this huge megaphone and platform, and they are pressured. Journalists are under pressure to have an opinion and a take on everything. And it's just exhausting because, first of all, a lot of people ruin their careers by tweeting stuff or Instagramming stuff impulsively. And it is really something, if I'm proud of one thing in my life, it's that every single time I've been on the verge. I type it and then I'm like, yeah, delete it. No. And I don't send it. And it's because it's just so tempting because you're angry about something or you really think that you want to tell people, how can you not see that this law or this legislation or this led to this? How do you live in a society that allows this to happen and children to suffer in this way? Whatever it is, just take a breath. Don't send it. That's really, if I had to give advice to younger people today, one of the main ones would be just don't have an opinion or a take on everything. And if you think a topic is important, then report the story.
Yes, exactly.
You know what I mean? Just then
You don't need to make it about you. Make it about the characters.
Yeah, like for instance, the evacuations in Sudan, the UK evacuations that were a shambles in the beginning, right? You don't need to say the UK government should be ashamed of itself for whatever. Just tweet the story of the family that was left behind in Port Sudan because their aunt was able to board a ship and she had to leave 5 children behind. People will figure it out. There's something, you know what I mean? You don't have to chew the meat for them.
And also, because that's what your job is. Your
Yeah.
job is to tell their story, not to get incensed and tell everybody what you think. Your job is to tell other people's stories.
It occurs to me that Hala Gorani's drafts folder would be seriously
Huge.
lit.
No, they don't even make it to the drafts
Oh,
folder.
yeah, they just
They
vanish.
vanish. They're typed. The tweet is typed out, and then it's deleted. It doesn't make it into the draft folder. But that is so important because social media has, in my opinion, it's just created a rot, frankly, and it's blurred the lines between journalism, activism, opinion, all sorts of things that are just maybe journalism adjacent professions, but that are strictly speaking. Then you have the trolls and you have the fake news from all the populist leaders encouraging their followers to insult and discredit our work, even though Clarissa will come from a place where she almost died to report a story, and I've just spent 20 years basically, as best I can, reporting and on stories and telling viewers every night what's going on in the world, and then you have to deal with that, and that is just one other aspect. So staying away from the activism and the opinion sharing also shields you a little bit from that. Really, just
the toxicity that is
the
that social
toxic
conversation.
and just unfortunate sort of development that our profession has experienced. I think.
Okay.
In the last, say, 5 to 10 years.
Let's take some questions from the audience. I'm sure you guys have a lot. Where is the microphone? One person gets hand up.
I'll be very brief. On October 17th of last year at 8 a.m. in the morning, we were in Kyiv together at the same hotel, and the drones came with no warning into Kyiv. and we all heard it back. Many of us were under it, and we're steaming into the door, the revolving door of the hotel we were staying at. And the only person who was headed out of that door was Clarissa Ward. Yeah, true story. She was, and her staff were behind her, not in front of her. But my question gets back to another issue that we both covered. I was very involved in Afghanistan, as you were. You were the face of girls in Afghanistan who have not been to school in ages. And I was just wondering, that's a huge story that you brought to light that was enormous, and it remains enormous. Why isn't the media holding governments to account on that issue? And why isn't that being followed up? You did trailblazing work on that, and they've been left for dead, and they're starving to death.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's it's one of the hardest parts of this job is that there's so many important stories, and it's really difficult to make sure that all of them are getting the attention that they very much deserve. And it's also very challenging to keep stories on the front pages for a protracted period of time. I would say in the case of Afghanistan, what has started to make it even more complex is that the Taliban has really been cracking down on access to Afghanistan. So we've had many journalists have their credentials removed or have visas refused, been kicked out of the country. And it has become so dangerous to try to report on what some of these brave girls are doing who are still in the country. Not dangerous for me, dangerous for them, that you start to have a really serious conversation with yourself about whether you're doing more harm than good by putting a spotlight on some of the risks that they're taking. So, and I would say the other thing that's always tricky journalistically is when you get to kind of an impasse in a conflict or a crisis whereby there's no answer in terms of, governments have not worked out, like, how are we going to deal with the Taliban? Are we going to deal with the Taliban? Will we unfreeze these funds? What would be the conditions to unfreeze these funds? And so when a story doesn't move, when it's kind of stuck in that space, it becomes very challenging to keep telling it in a dynamic way where it feels like there's progress. I don't mean that in a good or bad way, but just in a news is changing, the story is developing, and so you have to continue to cover it. And that on a personal level, I just haven't gone back. I very much wanted to, but Afghanistan is one of the few places that I wouldn't go to pregnant, just for obvious reasons in terms of healthcare access and stuff like that. I definitely want to go back after having this baby, but it is extremely difficult to work there now, and I don't even know if I would be able to get accreditation. So.
Okay, let's keep going. Just we'll take a couple and then we'll come back to the panel. So,
Over here.
Hi, thank you, first of all, both of you. You're both been incredible. I'm a journalist who's worked on Syria and all sorts of conflicts over the years, so a lot of what you said resonated. Just quickly, I wanted to know, I know you've given some great advice during this, but I still get asked a lot by young journalists, how do you cope with working non-stop on very brutal conflicts, and how and both of you, I think, mentioned the incessant nature of covering some of those. I just wondered if you had any sort of practical advice. I know the sort of wider points you made of not taking responsibility for it or whatever was absolutely brilliant. And the other is just as a female, and you both mentioned this, when it gets tough, it still is harder to say so as a woman than a man. And if there's just anything that you think would be advice on that sense as well.
let's take one more before we come back to the panel. Who else?
Yeah, Ben. Wait for the mic.
Other way.
Sorry.
Yeah, really quick. You've obviously covered issues which have been like on long-running war in Syria, war in Afghanistan, and so on. When there's a long-running conflict and you've got to find new ways to cover it to keep people engaged, do you go broader or do you go deeper?
Deeper.
More specific.
Okay, do you guys want to come? Do you want to answer some of what the lady was asking?
I think it's different for everyone. For me, it's just not consuming every frame of video. Your responsibility is to understand a story so that you can explain it to viewers, in our case viewers, and in your case it might be readers, but you have to unplug and not feel guilty that you're spending a week not reading anything about the news. In my case, now it's been a year. I mean, I still, read the news like someone interested in the news, but not, 8-10 hours a day. And give yourself permission to have fun, to enjoy your life. Give yourself permission to read a book that has nothing to do with the news, or to read poetry, or it sounds silly, but, read People magazine, some stupid thing like that, But I mean, you know what I mean? That's what I do, and it works a charm. It works a charm, and then you can go back in fresh. I think people who suffer mentally feel guilty that they're giving up on this story, and they feel guilty as if they're abandoning the people that they report on. And I can understand that, but I think they're doing themselves a disservice if they behave that way.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a couple
more.
Yeah, a couple more. Layla, do you have a? And we'll take one other. Those at the back. Come.
Hi, my name is Layla, journalist, also former CNNer. My question is about your books and the process. You discussed how your voice emerged and how in certain cases that developed and changed. Clarissa, you mentioned initially writing this for your children. I wanted to ask if that changed your view as you were writing. Did you have a particular reader in mind that you were writing for? And did that change or did it remain the same?
Good, thank you. And one more?
There's so many. Yeah, up front.
Thanks very much. Full confession, I absolutely adore both Clarissa and Hala, and I'm used to seeing them in the CNN bureau, not here. Curious to understand, at a very human level, if you look at Hala, I look at you and I think of Tahrir Square and the Stampede. Clarissa, I look at you and I think of what we've seen recently, especially the Ukraine, that beautiful elderly woman. You come back here, and then you're facing the Stampede at the Tube. How do you not get angry when you're dealing with a cocktail party and life can be so easy, and then you think, seriously, this is what's difficult, the increasing price of butter? I've always found it fascinating in terms of how do you process the surreal life of what you've come from to the reality of here, when the reality of there is just so profoundly different.
I think it's one of the main things that people don't talk about when you think of what, post-traumatic stress disorder looks like, or even just really profound stress after that kind of an assignment. And in the movies, it looks like people feeling really sad because they saw a dead child. And actually, in real life, it's kind of uglier than that. It's not sadness. It's not profound empathy for people who died. It's often detachment, and anger is a big part of it, for me at least. And that is scary, actually. I have been consumed by rage that I know is not necessarily, something that's part of my personality per se. It's something that is a response to things that I've witnessed and experiences I've had and very intense pressure that I've come under. And and the thing about anger is that we don't really accept it as a society. We accept sadness. It's a bummer, but we accept it kind of in terms of when we talk about mental health. But anger, I think we find much more difficult to be sympathetic to. And I actually think it's a much more common manifestation of that kind of, stress or PTSD. And it certainly has been for me. So, the first time you feel it, maybe you have that righteous sense of well, I'm feeling this because this is ridiculous and I've been in a much more profound situation. But when you start to come up against it more and more, that's when you kind of have to dig deep, and you have to really think about, okay, I can't just ignore this and pretend that things are going to be fine just because I'm back home and I can sleep in my own bed and take it easy. I actually have to really approach this head on and think of what I'm going to do with all this anger and where I put it and how I deal with it.
Hala, do you want to answer the question about audiences and who you write? You were initially writing a cookbook.
Believe me, you don't want to read any cookbook that I'm writing. No, I think the process is, look, you start out with something, you end up with something quite different, and that's where a good editor comes in, to be honest. When you're on your own, you think you're writing something great, and then when you have another pair of eyes on it, especially if it's a good editor, they are able to tell you if this is something that's just too inward looking, that really interests only a small group of people. I think I started out thinking I wanted to write more of a family saga because my family has quite an interesting trajectory over the last 100 years. And now that when I read my first version, the first version of the book back, I'm like, this is not that interesting. It's interesting for the Gorani family. That's why I was making a joke about it could be a cookbook, because it would kind of be just as interesting. You know, uncle such and such did this, and the great uncle did that, and we had a house in that neighborhood in Aleppo 80 years ago. It hadn't opened itself up to a wider audience, and that's the process for me. Is that I started out with a smaller, I think, potential readership, and opened it up to something a lot more interesting. So the process is solitary, but ultimately, if you have a good team around you, a good editor, another pair of eyes. I sent the first, second, and third draft to a few people as well, people I trust, whose opinion I trust. And they've also come back with good feedback. One of them is here, Dima Wanous. Where is she? She left, great. She loved my book, but she found this real boring.
Dima Wanous was the person I told you. He said, "Why didn't you start on time?" Let's take a couple more.
So anyway, but that's one example of how the process evolved. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to congratulate Clarissa on her expecting me by being very proud of you. Thank you so much.
You are? Oh, yes.
So my question yes. So my question is about the future of the Russian journalism. Do you still hold any future for the Russian journalism?
Okay.
Do you still feel they're able to express and have the will to actually being determined to deliver the message? Thank you.
Okay, and
I thought you wanted me to ask a question about Memoir.
oh yeah,
why
ask the lady next to you, and then we'll come to you. Yeah, that would be interesting.
Hello, Kate Lemchuk. I'm covering Ukrainian war, usually on Kyiv Post, and Kate goes tech on my Twitter. And I'd like to thank you. This is really a great example to follow what you ladies are doing. And I'm interested, you did mention that it's important to get yourself out of what you're covering and just not take all the responsibility, because it's very mentally taxing, and that's for sure true. But still, I'm sure you're making a huge impact with your work, being there and doing things that people are afraid to even think of. So can you give us some example, maybe just one, when you feel like your reporting has actually changed the course of history? And I'm sure there are plenty
that
of
is a nice
those.
question. Yeah, thank you. And then, yeah, ask your question if you don't mind, and then we'll get the panel to answer.
I'll try and make it succinct, but both of you, what you were saying is so resonant with my own experience. I'm Hadani Dikmars. I wrote a book on Iraq called Dancing in the No-Fly Zone about pre- and post-invasion culture a long time ago, in 2005, and I'm working on a new book. It always was going to be a memoir, but then it became very personal because it was bisected by the pandemic and my mother's diagnosis of ALS. So we were talking about that earlier. So I'm like you, Hala, I'm mixed race and I've traveled, and so I wanted to ask you, both of you, questions really about memoir and voice and identity. Often you thought I was Iraqi, my subject is conflated with my identity. So this is a larger discussion to have maybe over a drink, but is there a new field that is being created, sort of the mixed race gendered travelogue? Was there someone that you were inspired by, another woman writer? I've become the oldest PhD student in the world, and I'm looking at different women's voices and travelogues. And can you talk a little bit more about the journalistic and the sort of literary narrative and how you went back and forth between those two?
Thank you. That's quite a lot. Where do you want to start? Do you want to start with the narrative?
Are we going in the order of the questions?
Yeah,
or
whichever one you feel inclined to.
Well, I'll answer the
Yeah.
Russia
Yeah.
journalism
Yeah.
question. Journalism in Russia is dead. It's very, very sad. It doesn't mean there aren't amazing Russian journalists. There are. They're either no longer in Russia or they're not in a position where they can report safely inside Russia. We see a lot of really brave and brilliant Russian journalists who are setting up shop in Lithuania and Latvia, but it's very challenging for them. And I think they're trying to walk an impossible line now, especially in terms of how they cover Ukraine, because they want to be relevant to Russians, right? They don't want to just be parroting the views of the West. They want to be relevant to Russian people who might be reading, but that puts them in a compromised position in terms of. So I think, yeah, it's sort of like hitting the pause button for now. I have no doubt that it will come back at some stage, but for now, I'm sad to say I think it's dead. Yeah.
So going back to what I was saying earlier about how there's overlap between the journalistic process and the memoir writing process, I don't know if Clarissa feels the same way, but obviously you have to check your facts, you have to structure the narrative so that it's interesting and gripping in the same way you do a TV story. So there is an overlap. I read a lot of, I was a huge fan already of Anthony Shadid, who so tragically died at the beginning of the Syrian war. The Hair with the Amber Eyes, Edmund Duval, which is a great book as well. All those great sort of memoir/family history books I read, but then ultimately you've got to do your own thing and you've got to find your own voice. And that's where the editing and the revisions and all of that comes in into the process. So I think, yeah, just like I was saying earlier, there is an overlap between the two techniques. Seeking inspiration from really great writers like the two I just mentioned, there are others, and then ultimately just letting go of all of that and just telling your story in the way you want to tell it, and not trying to impress some imaginary reader in your mind. I think then you start writing in a way that's not very natural. Just let that go. That's how I'm approaching it anyway.
Did you find your home?
Yeah.
You will have to read the book.
Come in, so do you want to
I will send you a pre-order link from my unverified Twitter.
Do you want to answer the question the lady asked about if there was a particular moment you felt that you had really made a difference?
I really try not to focus too much on. There's a hubris that comes with that sort of thinking of, oh, I did such a great job and I made all these people do this or that. But I will say that occasionally you get a really wonderful email. I did a story in Afghanistan on a few girls whose stories really broke my heart and kind of stayed with me. And then a year later, I got an email from a man in California who said, I saw your piece and I got all three of those girls out of Afghanistan. So you're like, wow, okay. First of all, we have a viewer. Still got one. But no, and actually in the case of Ukraine, I had an email yesterday from someone who said, I saw your piece about this volunteer group who go and repatriate the bodies of Ukrainian soldiers and take them back to their families. And my husband was really inspired and he's a volunteer now for the group. He's an American in Ukraine. So occasionally you'll have those moments where you're like, someone does watch, and but it can never be because you are pushing for that energetically. Like in terms of like where your intentions need to be, like it needs to be with just doing a great job of telling the story, and then the rest of it will happen in a natural and organic way. And sometimes it will be really rewarding, and sometimes it will be heartbreaking, and you'll get a story. You'll hear back that someone you talked to was kidnapped or killed or had to leave their home because they were threatened, and so you can't become too attached to any one outcome.
Okay, let's take a last few questions. The lady at the back, and then, yeah, over there.
My name is Nawal Abdi Samad. I'm quite early into my career in journalism. I just wanted to ask, what advice would you give to a woman like me starting out in the industry? Or let me rephrase that. Is there an advice that you both got that stuck with you that you'd like to share?
That is a nice question. Did you want to ask? You had something at the back, yeah.
Oh, wow.
And then we'll take one more. Pick one.
Hello, thanks so much. I'm Sia from the BBC Persian. Great to see you here. I just wanted to know, how do you compare impartiality when it comes to journalism between the US journalism and the UK? Here in the UK, we think there's a lot of partisanship in the US journalism, the talk shows that we see, what we see from Fox. Even the CNN is sort of, probably CNN inside the US, and we're talking about the CNN International, is sort of sometimes accused of taking sides inside the political atmosphere of the US. So how do you, I would say, could you please enlighten me what's happening in the US?
Yeah, the evening is almost over. So. All right, good. And one more. Let's take one more. Yes, the lady over here. Thank you, Zia. Over there.
Hi, thank you. Nice to meet you. So the emotion I'm most struggling with as a young journalist is anger, particularly because I feel like the other side on social media, particularly covering Roe v. Wade and the overturning last year, I just felt this visceral anger. How do you deal with that when approaching your memoir and approaching your reporting, to kind of let that temper down a bit? Because I know it's bad for my reporting, but I'm really fighting it at the moment, and that's, especially as a woman, I feel it's quite hard to be angry in a work environment.
Very nice, thank you. Let's start with that, if you don't mind, and then we'll end with the advice, the best advice you got. Start with Hala.
I'll let Clarissa answer the anger question, because I think you have an interesting.
I'll
answer the young lady, because I have some advice for you.
Great. I think that, like, first of all, just you don't fight it, right? Like, you accept it. You're allowed to feel angry. You're allowed to feel sad. You're allowed to feel all sorts of different things. It's how you channel those emotions and how you deal with them, and how you continue to behave professionally in spite of them. And so, I usually let myself have a while to kind of throw my toys out of the pram and scream and sulk and, abuse my husband. And then I really try to focus on, like, don't get mad, get even, right? And it's like, I'm going to tell the best damn story you've ever seen. And it's going to bring people to tears. And after I've said all this stuff about not trying to project the outcome, God. So, just try to focus it on doing great work and telling a great story. Like, channel it, because otherwise it's going to eat you up, and you're going to sit on Twitter all day with a terrible case of heartburn, and you're not going to be doing a damn thing to actually have an impact,
And I will add, journalism, even though there's a blurring of the lines now, is a craft, and when you lose yourself in the craft, if you're a young journalist, it is extremely satisfying. It's kind of one of the reasons, too, leaving anchoring for me and potentially embracing journalism, more reporting style journalism in the future is something I want to look at, because it is incredibly intellectually stimulating and satisfying, and that's where the anger doesn't come in. Then it's the technical aspect of putting a story together, and that I wanted to tell the young lady in the back is my advice. My advice is learn the craft of journalism. It is a job. It's not just sort of willy-nilly. It's not tweeting. It's not TikTok. You have to learn how to source a story, check the facts, put the story together, build the narrative arc, do all of that. And one of the best places to learn that is local journalism. Even though they're closing newsrooms left, right, and center, I would say if you can find a local radio station, a local affiliate of a big network in the north of England, wherever, That's where I started out in the north of France, writing for La Voix du Nord, which is this really regional newspaper, but you do everything. You take the picture, you interview the subjects for the piece, you put it together. I would even type it into the computer at the end. That would be my advice, because the craft of journalism is so satisfying when you learn it and you execute it. It's one of the best feelings. And this is how you know you love your job, really, is when you enjoy the process, not just the outcome and not just its impact.
I think on that very positive note we will end. Zero. 1 minute. 1 minute, Ran. 1 minute. Thank you all for coming, genuinely. It is genuinely a privilege to spend time with you guys in this environment, to hear your thoughts. It really means a lot to me. It means a lot to the magazines that you guys come out. I want to say, if you guys are on Twitter, we have tweeted a little bit. It is very, very helpful for us if you tweet things that you enjoyed, pictures. It really does make a difference long term. So thank you all for coming. I cannot thank you enough, Hala Gorani.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Stick around for a little bit longer, I hope, and we'll have a drink and we'll talk a little bit more, and maybe we'll answer Zia's questions about the future of America. Thank you.